Thanks for coming back to committee, folks. It is 10 a.m.-ish, and we are going to spend some time with Chris Roop on education, finance, pensions, and then return to the legislative language that we looked at yesterday with John Gray, and then we have our tax workshop at lunchtime if you want to join us, Chris. And I invited Chris to join us because anytime we have significant changes in the size of the state employee workforce or the teacher's workforce, there might or might not be pension obligations related to that implications. And so I wanted Chris to tell us what to be mindful as we do this work.
Well, good morning, everyone. For the record, Chris Roop from the Joint Fiscal Office. It's nice to see you all today. Torcia graciously put quite a few documents up on the website under my name today. I'm really just focusing, I'm going to go through the slides, but there are a few actuarial reports that we posted also, just if you really are curious and want to dig deep into the weeds. But today I was hoping to give everyone sort of a high level overview real quick about how pensions work, particularly in the education space, and give you all some considerations in terms of how any significant shifts in the active workforce could translate into impacts to the retirement system. And I want to leave some time for questions. So it's like I could go on and on about this stuff as returning legislators know. So just as a quick overview, most Vermont teachers participate in the state teachers retirement system. We call that VSTRS. The little cheat, because there's a lot of acronyms in this world, is look for the T in the name, T for teacher. The system provides a defined benefit pension to eligible members and their beneficiaries. And that benefit is calculated by a formula that takes into account your years of service credit, your average final compensation over the three highest consecutive years, which are typically toward the end of a member's career. And then you multiply those by a benefit multiplier, which is 1.67% for the first 20 years, then a slightly higher one for years after that. And I just give you an example here of how that math works. There's a cap on the maximum benefit of 60% of AFC, and benefits are subject to a COLA, an automatic COLA that is tied to the Consumer Price Index. That COLA is based on 50% of the year-over-year change in the CPI from fiscal year to fiscal year. And there are some minimums and maximums in statute, like there's a 0% minimum and a 4% maximum. And depending on when you retire, you might have to wait, 24 months to collect your first COLA. Something important also to keep in mind is that teachers, and this is sort of a general rule with our pension systems, we have a vesting requirement where you need to have at least 5 years of service in order to be entitled to a pension benefit. And you also need to meet some eligibility criteria in order to first begin drawing a benefit. So in our system, you are eligible for early reduced retirement if you're 55, but normal retirement happens when you're either 65 years old or you reach what's called the rule of 90, which is when your age plus your years of service total 90. So this is the statutory definition of who's in the teacher pension system. What's the meaning of a teacher? You can see that that this is a condition of employment for all teachers according to statute. And when we're talking about who's in the teacher system, we're talking about licensed teachers, principals, supervisors, superintendents, and licensed professionals. We are not talking about non-teachers in the teacher pension system. And I'm going to get to how we treat non-teaching school staff a little bit further in the slide deck. This is just an overview that shows you the membership trends of the teacher pension system. The blue columns represent the active members. You can see that there's just shy of 10,600 active members at the end of FY24, and that has been relatively stable over time. The orange bars show the number of retirees and beneficiaries, people who are currently receiving a payment from the system who are not currently working. You can see that the system has, in actuary speak, the system has matured quite a bit since the Great Recession. A lot of that is demographically driven. There's been a large cohort of baby boomers who have been aging out of the workforce. And something that's really important to keep in mind is that a more mature system where you have more of that one-to-one ratio, it's not necessarily like a bad thing because pension systems are set up to pay out benefits to people. But a more mature system behaves a little bit differently than a less mature system. So I sort of think about trying to turn around an aircraft carrier. Like whenever you have a really mature system, it can sometimes take longer for changes to ripple through the system because so much of your existing liability is tied into people who are already retired. And with cash flow, there's different concerns. So when you have a lot of people drawing benefits out of the system, a lot of cash flow is leaving the system. And we fortunately just reached a point in the teacher system where we're now cash flow positive, which means, which is a really important risk mitigation strategy because that means the state is paying more into the system than it's necessarily paying out in benefits. I should say from all sources, contributions in are exceeding benefits out, which means you don't necessarily have to sell assets at a undesirable time in order to make benefit payments. So if you had a brand new system that had very few retirees and was very well funded, you could probably tolerate a much different level of risk in your investments than a system like we have, which is mature. It's been around a long time. It's not fully funded. It's got funding challenges. And there's a lot of people who are depending on benefits being paid out of those assets every year. So it's just important to be mindful of the fact that they behave a little differently. Here's some data that shows over time how the active membership and the retired membership have trended. If you're wondering why everything sort of starts at the end of FY 2008 on my slides, it's because we're in a 30-year closed amortization period that began at the end of fiscal year 2008. So that's a helpful way of sort of assessing like what has happened during our current amortization period, because that is what's influencing the amount of unfunded liability that we have to pay off by 2038. So you can see on the left in that chart, the active covered payroll has increased steadily over time, which you would expect with just payroll growth. But it hasn't on average increased at a really dramatic rate. The compound annual growth rate since 2008 has been 2.33%. The long-term actuarial assumption is 3% growth. You also see that over time, the average age of the active workforce has gotten slightly younger and slightly less seasoned in terms of experience. And that's indicative of the fact that you've had a lot of people of the baby boomer generation leaving the active workforce since 2008. Over on the right, you'll get a sense of the trends in retired membership in terms of the number of retirees and beneficiaries who are in pay status and getting benefits out of the system, and a sense of what the total average annualized retirement allowance has been over time. And that is not reflective of the exact amount of money that has gone out of the system from like refunds and actual benefit payments. The actuaries present this every year as an estimate. They take the June payout amounts and annualize them. And that's a nice way of sort of getting your head around the trends over time. So you'll see that the compound annual growth rate of 7.38 has been higher than the growth in the overall active payroll, but that's because we've had more people drawing benefits out of the system. We've also had, COLAs that increase that benefit with inflation over time. But you can still see over on the far left that on average across everybody, the benefit is, just over $24,000 a year. So there are some people make more than that, some people make less than that, but that is a nice little sense of where the average is.
Chris, you have a figure there, average compensation, 73,263 for teachers. That's a little different than what we heard from previous testimony in regards to the education.
This might not just be teachers. This could include some administrators and
Okay.
folks like that too, who have teaching certificates.
Got it.
So how we've been talking about pensions, we should probably just explain how pensions work at a high level. The real neat thing about pensions is that they're pre-funded. And pre-funding doesn't sound that interesting until you really look under the hood and you realize that that is a good way of using investment gains to pay for future expenses rather than having those costs fully be borne by the taxpayers. So pre-funding will often require some near-term financial sacrifices because you often have to pay more to pre-fund than you would on what we would call a pay-go basis, at least initially. But over time, the taxpayer saves real money through investment gains. And on average, across the country, NASRA has estimated that over 60% of the cost of pension benefits are typically paid for from investment gains. So the taxpayer can really win over time by being able to leverage investment gains to pay for these costs.
What was that percentage?
Over 60%. So the way this works in practice is both the active employee and the employer will make contributions into the pension system over the course of your active career. The pension systems through VPIC will invest that money, and then the resulting assets, the contributions plus those compound investment gains are what fund the retirement benefits. Something important to keep in mind is that the money that active employees are paying into the system, that money goes toward the normal cost of the benefits, but it doesn't fully cover the normal cost. So the normal cost references the cost of the benefits that are earned by the active workforce each year, plus the admin costs to run the plan. So every year that you've got active members in the system, they're earning service credit, they're earning a future benefit. That is what we call the normal cost. And the normal cost, what that is every year, what in terms of like the amount is really based on the size and the characteristics of the active workforce and the actuarial assumptions that are in place. Just for some context, in the current fiscal year, the normal cost, including the admin cost, is just over 11.7% of the projected active payroll in the teacher system. Teachers contribute on average about 6.75% of that, and the remainder, just under 5% of payroll, is paid by the employer, and in this case, that's the state. So looking at the normal cost as a percentage of pay can be a really helpful proxy for sort of getting your head around the relative cost of a pension benefit, because it helps standardize things like, people make more money or less money in some place, but being able to tie what is their benefit cost as a percentage of pay is a useful way to sort of compare apples to apples. The state share, the employer share, the state funds the remainder of the normal cost that the employee contributions do not fully fund, plus the amortization payments on the unfunded liability. And we refer to that total cost of those two pieces that are paid by the employer as the ADEC, the Actuarial Determined Employer Contribution. That is like one of those acronyms you'll hear me throw around all the time. When we talk about the unfunded liability, what we're really talking about is that gap, that shortfall between the liabilities, which means how much the system owes in benefits, and the assets that are on hand to pay those liabilities, and everything's discounted on a present value basis. As I mentioned earlier, under our current amortization structure in statute, our unfunded liabilities are scheduled to be paid off by FY 2038. And payments are structured to grow in 3% future increments every year in order to mirror the estimated long-term rate of growth in payroll. So that's sort of a budget-friendly way of doing things so that in theory, pension costs stay a relatively constant share of your total personnel budget. It doesn't work like your 30-year fixed mortgage at home where, over time, the payment gets relatively cheaper. Ours are structured in a way so that the costs grow with overall payroll growth. And something important to keep in mind is that a few years ago, when you all dealt with Act 114, the big pension reform bill, a key provision called for what we call the plus payments. And that is an accelerated payment on the unfunded liability. Those plus payments are made by the state from the general fund. They began in FY 24 at 9 million. They go up to 15 million in FY 26. And that will stay in effect until the pension system hits 90% funded. And that is expected in FY 2035.
That's so soon.
It is surprisingly soon, actually,
It's
like.
gotten here faster than they
Every time I talk about this stuff and we throw around like 2038, everybody's like, oh, it's so far, we won't be here by then. We're working on the 26 budget right now, like, we're not real far away, and we're in some pretty critical years right now. So this is really the point in the 30-year amortization period where we're really, really chipping away at the principle of that unfunded liability, because and I'm gonna go down a rabbit hole real quick here, but the downside to having that level percent of pay amortization policy where your payments grow by 3% a year is that your progress on paying down the principal is backloaded. So you make most of that progress in the last like decade of the 30 years. So we're now at that point where we're really starting to chip away. The plus payment, I just want to remind everybody that mathematically sort of works similarly as if you were making an extra mortgage payment every year. You're saving interest costs, and the impact of that overpayment gets reflected in the future ADEC calculations on a 2-year lag. So if you put extra money into the system in FY25, it gets recognized in the FY25 actuarial valuation, and the FY27 ADEC will go down a little bit in reflection of the fact that you made that extra payment. So you don't have to like wait till the end of the period and have like, one fewer payment to make. This gets recognized in the math on just a 2-year lag. So the more you pay in the short term means you save money in the out years. And that has the effect of actually flattening out that rate of growth in future payments when all else is equal.
Chris, this is a theoretical liability. This is not, it is a liability, but it's not like we have a bond that's out for that amount of the liability that we're chipping away out with payments.
It's a little different than a bond. This is based on actuarial projections. So the number change, the amount of money that we have to pay off, the unfunded liability, gets recalculated every year.
Yeah.
So there's a dynamic element to it, and you can do everything right, and something can still go wrong somewhere else, like the economy can tank and you don't earn 7% on your money, and you could still end up with a cost. So I think something to keep in mind is that every time we talk about pensions, we're talking about an assumption that all of our assumptions are going to be met moving forward, and that we're sort of holding all else equal. I think we all know that reality isn't that neat, but it's the only way we can really talk about this coherently.
Can you remind us what's in place to sort of check and refresh the assumptions?
Yeah, so every 3 years, the systems do what's called an experience study. And an experience study, they just did one in 2023. And at that point, what they do is the actuaries will do a deep dive into your current assumptions, your experience over the last few years, and they'll take a look at have expectations for the future changed? And if they had, it might make sense to true up and revise your assumptions moving forward. In those of you who have been around a few years will remember that the prior experience study in 2019, a major finding from that was a recommendation to lower the assumed rate of return from 7.5 to 7%. And that drove up employer pension costs pretty significantly from FY21 to FY22. And that is what prompted the pension reform discussion that happened a few years ago. So truing up actuarial assumptions, in my view, as your nonpartisan fiscal analyst, is not a bad thing. It is prudent management. And it is something that I think is important to do just to reflect the fact that expectations for the world sometimes change. If you go back to the 90s, you could earn more than 7% on your money by taking very little investment risk. You could put money in, CDs and, savings accounts, and the interest rate environment back then was really paying off. The economic environment has changed. So Vermont is not an outlier by the fact that we've gradually reduced our assumed rates of return, and at 7%, we're very much in line with most other major pension systems. So that's the periodic. Every 3 years, you take a look and do a deep dive. Every year, though, we do what's called the actuarial valuations. And that's when you just look at what happened in the last fiscal year. And 1 year of data does not make a trend. But that is how we calculate what the budget needs are going to be for the ADAC every year. So,
Go ahead, Representative.
Oh, yeah, Chris, thank you. Well, I was in Ways and Means downstairs when we began to get started on this stuff, because it was clear that the assumptions that people had made were wildly optimistic in retrospect. And so, or at least enough optimistic to have screwed things up. So this is, I would say, very good news. I'm glad to hear it.
things are trending in the right direction.
That's a good way to say it, but that's good.
And you can't just take my word for it. This graphic will show you. So the red line here shows you the liabilities. That's how much the system owes in benefits to the folks who are already retired, folks who are, already working and have earned that benefit. It's not sort of a forward, it's what's already in the books to be paid out. That dotted green line at the bottom is then the actuarial value of assets. So that's the amount of money that we have on hand as of the valuation dates to pay those liabilities. And the actuarial value of assets smooths out investment gains and losses over a 5-year period. And that helps. That's a very budget-friendly practice. It's very common. And as you all know, investments can be very volatile. So if you have, a year where you had a -2% return, and then another year with like a +20% return, that could really swing the pendulum on your ability to fund the ADAC pretty significantly. So most pension systems, including ours, have a policy in place where they smooth out those gains and losses over a 5-year basis to try to just address some of that year-over-year volatility. The gap between the red line and that green line, that represents the unfunded liability. So you'll see over in 2008, when the amortization period began, that unfunded liability, that gap was a little less than $400 million. Now that gap is around $1.7 billion. And the easy way to get your head around that is through what's called the funded ratio. And that's just the mathematical exercise of, assets divided by liabilities. You'll see that we began at 81% funded, steadily declined down to 51.3% funded. That was right around the time that the assumed rate of return was changed from 7.5 to 7. But in the years since, the system has made steady progress at improving its funded ratio. Now it's 61.2% funded on an actuarial basis. By FY38, under our current law, the future payments are structured so that that dotted green line and that red line converge by 2038, and you would reach 100% funded. So just real quick on how we get there and how we fund that cost. As I mentioned, active employees contribute a percentage of pay at a rate that varies based on their salary in the teacher system. This was another element of the Act 114, was that a pay band system was put in place where the amount you contribute differs based on how much you earn. And those rates range from 6.15% for those earning up to $40,000 to 7.35% for those earning $100,000 or more. These are not marginal rates. These are, if your salary fits within a band, you pay this on every dollar, but the bands do not change really dramatically from one level to another to sort of minimize any cliff effect. The employer, their contribution is not set specifically as a rate in statute. Instead, the employer contribution is recalculated every year in the actuarial valuations. And that amount is based on the total normal cost. So that's who's in the system and how much are their benefits expected to cost, what is the admin cost assumption, plus what is the unfunded liability balance and the amortization policy you have in place. So those are recalculated every year in the valuation. We can't exactly predict the future. If we could, we would all be very wealthy people, I'm sure. But we can use actuarial assumptions to really try to get an estimate of when members are going to retire, how much their benefits are going to cost. And, they can be more aggressive or more conservative depending on the risk appetite of the pension system. But I think it's just important that from a governance perspective, that these are regularly reviewed and grounded in some sense of reality. And I think the systems you have in Vermont are very focused on ensuring that. Some of the assumptions, when we talk about assumptions, what are we talking about? The experience study, which is posted on the committee page, will walk you through in detail what these look like. But we're talking about things like the assumed rate of return. What do we expect our money is going to earn in investment gains every year moving forward? It's currently 7%. What's the inflation assumption long-term that influences some of the other assumptions? What are the assumed rates of cost of living adjustments for folks who are in retirement? What are the assumed rates of salary increases as well as total payroll growth in the active workforce? There's assumptions about the demographics of the membership, retirement and net turnover behavior, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more in another slide, mortality, disability, and how much does it cost to run the system as a percentage of pay. As I mentioned, when these assumptions change, it will change the size of the liabilities and the amount that must be contributed by the employer, like by default. And I just made a note here again that the experience studies are the periodic reviews that inform what those assumptions should be moving forward. So the state pays for the employer pension cost for teachers from different sources. And I just posted an issue brief on the JFO website yesterday that if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, you can read it in detail. But at a high level.
And if members ask you about this corner of both our education reform work and just our general work, it's great to point them to that.
Exactly. So whenever you look at the Ed Fund outlooks, you will often see a line there that says Beester's pension and Beester's OPEB. We are talking, what those lines reflect are the normal cost for those benefits and the employer share of the normal cost. That cost is primarily funded from the Ed Fund off the top and not reflected in local school budgets, though decisions made at the local level do influence that normal cost. The unfunded liability costs are funded primarily from the general fund. A few exceptions here are that the schools with federally funded staff will make payments for those staff, and those payments offset the normal cost and the unfunded liability that would otherwise fall to the Ed Fund or general fund. So there's a relatively small sliver of the ADAC is paid through the LEAs on their federally funded staff. Something that's also really important to keep in mind and is that, I am happy to, not happy, I am willing to acknowledge the fact that the state did not always fully fund the employer share of teacher pension contributions. Right. From 1979 through 2006, I think the ADAC was underfunded in all but 4 years. But moving forward, especially in the current amortization period, there has been no intentional employer underfunding. What the impact of underfunding is that we began the amortization process with an unfunded liability balance of, I think it was just under $380 million, and some portion of that was due to legacy underfunding. So what's really important to keep in mind is that the ADAC is dynamically calculated every year. So if you short a payment year, the future ADACs essentially go up to sort of make sure that that's paid back. Like you can't just like short the ADAC and like your financial responsibility just disappears. I mean, it shows up in future payments and you're going to have to make the system whole with interest moving forward. So some portion of that unfunded liability got reflected in the future ADAC calculations. But whenever the task force was doing its thing a few years ago, the former treasurer did an analysis and quantified or estimated that I think less than a sixth of the unfunded liability balance was due to legacy underfunding. So it's a thing, but it was not the primary reason why we've seen the unfunded liability grow from under $380 million to around $1.7 billion within the confines of the current amortization period, because the state has been making its payments. It's actually been overfunding the ADAC. And I just walked through here to remind you, I already talked about this, but what those plus payments look like, and remind everyone that as part of Act 114, the state made a $125 million one-time payment to the teacher pension system. So we're not.
Yep.
That's really helpful context. I would point out that it's not reflected in budgets, but it is reflected in their tax rates, and that's something, yeah, that we have to think about. And I know that part of this was that we were overestimating returns quite significantly for some period. Is my understanding, is that true? And
I'm gonna show you a slide
Oh,
that walks you
awesome. I
through
love
all
this.
of it.
I love this. I'm just gonna shut up and let you roll it out.
No, it's a great question. So this just shows you, the costs of maintaining these two systems is not insignificant to the state budget.
Yeah.
I pulled data here from the governor's operating budgets from the last few years. There's a report toward the end that will break out the budgeted amounts by fund and what the estimate from the LEA contributions are going to be. And it's fascinating, but doesn't reflect actual payments in. This is budgetary to give you a sense of like what the projections are. But I think a lot of people don't realize just how much cost the general fund is picking up for teacher retirement costs. Over $200 million a year out of the state budget. You'll see that in FY26, 161 million goes to the actuarially calculated unfunded liability payment. Then there's that additional $15 million plus payment that is going to stay in effect until FY35 or until the systems hit 90% funded. The orange block there shows you how much is paid off the top from the ed fund toward the normal costs. And the blue bar or the gray bar on the OPEB slide show the amount that comes in from the LEAs, and that amount is split between the normal cost and the general and the unfunded liability cost. But this really shows you like where the money's coming from on the employer side by the funding source. So you'll see that it's gone up in recent years, and something to keep in mind is that if all of your assumptions are perfectly met, you would still see these go up in dollar terms every year because of assumed payroll growth and because of that 3% amortization policy that I had mentioned. So it's not necessarily like, it doesn't mean the sky is falling to see those dollars increase. You would actually expect that. What you want to understand is like, are they increasing higher at a rate higher than you had initially thought, and what's driving that? That's really what's important to understand. So when we're talking about assumptions, I wanted to just draw some attention to a few things to really keep in mind in the context of where we are in the education conversation. There are a few assumptions that pertain to the active workforce that do have some impact on the pension system and how much we should fund and the impact on the unfunded liability. And some of those are the rates of salary increases that the active workforce receives. If you go to the experience study, you'll actually see these very detailed charts that show you what the current assumptions are, where like people at different ages and points in their careers are assumed to have different rates of annual salary growth. So the rate those change, not only the assumptions, but how experience jives with those assumptions, that all impacts pension costs. Retirement and termination behavior can also significantly influence pension costs. If you have people retiring earlier than assumed, that can add costs because we all know people who, out of the goodness of their heart or for whatever reason, continue to work beyond the point at which they're first eligible to retire. And the actuaries have some assumptions about that. And if more people are retiring sooner and not working beyond that point where they're first eligible, that could add costs. Termination is sort of a different side of a similar coin, and that gets at how many people and what are the rates of people leaving the active workforce for reasons other than retirement. So if you were to work for 5 years earlier in your career and then leave, that is a very different impact on the pension system than somebody who works their entire life and then retires, because your work experience influences your average final compensation, and that's what drives your benefit cost.
I noticed in one of your earlier slides that termination was bumped up in 2015 by a bit. Was there a reason for that?
The which earlier slide?
Page 4, I believe.
Oh, yeah. My understanding, and I wasn't here then, was that that was around a period of time where I think there were some early retirement incentives And,
There's a real question.
and I'm going to get to that because that was
That's one of the key takeaways of today's.
that's one of the key takeaways, and you just skipped like right ahead.
Thank you for asking.
If you have an extra gold star.
I think the treasurer at the time was very upset.
So getting back to what Representative Holcomb asked, what drove the growth in that unfunded liability from the beginning of the amortization period to where we are today? This bar chart will show you adding up across all the years, the cumulative impact that different factors had on the unfunded liability. And annoyingly, just remember that negatives are good in this situation and positives are not good. Positives are things that increase the unfunded liability and negatives are things that reduced it. You'll see here that the most significant the most significant factors were changes to actuarial assumptions to reflect evolving expectations about the future. Investment experience was a significant source of loss, but I want to put an asterisk next to that because most of that occurred due to the Great Recession. A few other things are retirement and net turnover behavior and the former practice of funding OPEB from the pension fund, which had a similar impact of underfunding the EDAC. If you want to get really, really detailed, this shows you every year how that unfunded liability has accumulated over time. So way over on the right side, those are the total in that yellow column. Those are the totals that were reflected in my last slide. But you'll see, especially when you look at the investment experience, most of that impact was concentrated in FY 2009. And the baseline when we're evaluating investment experience isn't zero. The baseline currently is 7%. So if you earn a 6% rate of return consistently, that's still more money, but it's less than your assumption of 7. So that would be reflected in an actuarial loss for these purposes. So it's just important to be mindful of the fact that success isn't zero. Success is what your assumptions are. But you'll see here that every year there's little gains and losses all over the place. Like reality is not perfect. And there are just, over time, you'll have a gain in something, you'll have a loss in something. And it's important to understand what's driving that. But when you look at retirements and net turnover, to Representative Higley's question, they were significant factors in prior years. And you see the really big impact on the assumption change line. I want to mention that that's a really big number, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Because if you were to have unrealistically optimistic assumptions that you're never going to meet, you're going to see more losses reflected in the bottom part of this chart. And those losses show up in the unfunded liability. And that's kind of like putting those costs on the state's credit card and you have to pay it back with interest over time. So having true costs accurately reflected in the assumptions is sound fiscal policy.
Do you remember what year it was that I can't remember what year it was that we addressed the issue around federal employees because they had not been paying their employer contribution?
I do not know. I don't know if the treasurer's office knows, but
I can find it.
I don't know.
I believe it was in the teens.
It was definitely.
Will you, wait, sorry, Rebecca, one second. Can you introduce yourself for the record?
Sorry, Tim Duggan, Director of Vermont Retirement Systems from the Treasurer's Office. I can figure that out.
Back to you, Chris.
So real quick, I wanted to mention, I've been talking about teachers this whole time because that is where we focus a lot of our attention on because the state budget directly funds that system through the general fund and the ed fund. But the non-teaching staff that are employed by schools, many of them participate in VMERS, the municipal system. VMERS is different because it's funded directly by the participating employees and employers. There's not a line item in the state budget that directly funds these pension costs the way the retirement costs for teachers are funded. And in VMERS, both parties pay stated contribution rates as a percentage of pay that vary across the 4 benefit groups within that system. The systems are a little different. VMERS is smaller and it's less mature. There's more actives than retireds in the VMERS system. VMERS has a higher funded ratio and a much smaller unfunded liability. But something to keep in mind is that the VEMR's ADAC has not been fully funded in recent years. The stated contribution rates have not been generating enough revenue to fully fund the actuarially determined amounts. And as a result, the funded ratio of that system has been ticking downward in recent years. In an effort to correct that, you all in several recent budgets have passed a schedule of rate increases where contributions from employees and employers are scheduled to increase by 25 basis points a year each year until FY30. So over time, the funding situation is going to gradually improve from where it is right now. But a lot of the same concepts that apply to VSTRs are also applying to VMERS. The benefit structures are just different. The 4 groups earn a different benefit structure than the teachers do. And something important to keep in mind is that these costs are reflected in local school budgets. So if there are gains or losses to the VMERS system, those cost pressures would trickle down directly to the operating budgets that are employing those VMERS members. They wouldn't directly impact the general fund or the ed fund off the top, but they would show up in budgets. The universe of people who are in VMERS is a little bit different. And something to keep in mind is employers, municipalities and school districts have to opt in to participate in VMERS. I don't think they all do, but school employees are a sizable portion of the VMERS membership. I think it's like half of the membership. So it's not an insignificant number of people. So I'm just going to pivot away from like numbers and just get a little high level here that, a question you all might have been thinking about is what happens to the pension funds if there's a significant change in the size of the active workforce? Well, generally, fewer active members would lead to reduced normal cost and accruing liabilities over time if the workforce remained at a reduced level long term. Remember that active employee contributions fund a portion of the normal cost, but not the entire normal cost. And the active employees are not funding the unfunded liability. So if there were fewer people actively employed, there would be less liability accruing in the system, less benefits that need to be paid out. But there are a few other considerations you should keep in mind. How the workforce changes in size matters. And specifically to Representative Higley's point, does a effort at reducing the active workforce significantly change retirement behavior? Former Treasurer Pierce always talked about squeezing the balloon, how you push it at one end, it pops out at the other. And this was often talked about in the context of early retirement incentives, where if you were to encourage higher paid people to retire at an earlier age than they otherwise would, that can cause losses to the pension system. Is the workforce reduction sustained long term? If so, over time, the pension system would generally see a slower rate of liability growth in dollar terms in the future. But if it were to be reduced and then just pop back up, the pension system could take a hit from some behavior changing, but not really have a long-term benefit, for lack of a better word, of that lower liability reduction. You can mitigate some of the downside through strategies like attrition and spreading the impact across the workforce. Downside, though, could also increase if you target one specific subset of the workforce and causes their retirement or turnover behavior to change very significantly from what you had assumed. I just want to remind everybody that experience and assumptions are both important factors. The assumptions aren't perfect, but whenever your actual experience changes dramatically from those assumptions, that can cause gains or losses. And we often think a lot about just the investment rate of return and how well the money's doing. That is significant, but that's not the only factor you need to keep in mind. That retirement and net turnover experience were very, very significant contributors to that growth in unfunded liability. I want to mention OPEB real quick. OPEB is subsidized retiree healthcare benefits, other post-employment benefits. They do represent another significant long-term liability to the state, and those costs are funded similarly to how teacher pensions are funded, with the normal cost funded by the ed fund, the unfunded liability by the general fund. And the local schools contribute something called the new teacher assessment, which is a flat annual amount that's indexed to inflation. It's around $1,500 this year for every teacher who first entered the VSTER system after 2015. But the vast majority of the OPEB costs borne by the employer are reflected in the state budget directly. Members do not make a contribution out of their paycheck while they're working. Instead, they pay a share of the premium of health insurance once they're retired. VMERS does not offer a OPEB benefit. And the generosity of the subsidy varies based on your years of service. So once you have 25 years of service, you're entitled to an 80% subsidy for healthcare coverage plus spousal coverage. So OPEB liabilities work a little different than pensions. But there are some similarities. They're driven largely by the length of retirement that is assumed. Healthcare cost trend rates are a huge factor, and they can be notoriously unpredictable over time. Your years of service in terms of how they translate to the subsidy rates one would be entitled to, and obviously the number of people claiming subsidized healthcare benefits. Generally, the more expensive members to cover are those with higher years of service, spousal coverage, because they're entitled to the more generous subsidy, and those who retire prior to becoming eligible for Medicare, because those few years to provide coverage to people before they're eligible for Medicare has a higher cost per year. But that does not represent a huge portion of the total OPEB liability. It's just on a per year basis, it's more expensive to cover a member then. Something to keep in mind is that if more teachers with long years of service retire sooner than they otherwise would, it could lead to increased enrollment in OPEB, which could increase liabilities in the near term, particularly if that's occurring in those pre-Medicare eligibility years. Similar to pensions, though, if you have fewer active members earning future OPEB benefits, generally you would expect that pressure on future growth in OPEB liabilities to go down over time when all else is equal. Vermont began to pre-fund teacher OPEB very recently, in 2023, on an amortization schedule that ends in 2048, not 2038. So we're a little ways off. Before that, there was no systematic pre-funding policy in place. And prior to 2015, the costs were paid from the assets of the pension system, which contributed to the decline in the funding situation over there. We are at like the very, very beginning of the journey here. 11.6% funded is nothing to sneeze at given where we were a few years ago, but we have a long way to go here. So buckle up, it's going to be a long ride. But the only way to really chip away at these long-term liabilities is every year have a very disciplined approach at funding the EDAC and being very, very mindful of cost containment and just be disciplined overall, because the problem isn't going to magically go away. The only way it's resolved is through sustained fiscal commitment. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them in the 10 minutes we have left. And if you want further reading material, there are tons of links here.
Chris, this Vermont state employees that work for the college system, their retirement is a defined contribution plan, right? And how does that work, and how is state involved in that piece of it?
I don't believe we're involved in it.
Okay.
In the state colleges.
Do teachers pay into and also qualify for Social Security?
Yes.
Yes,
Not in every state, but here they do.
but here they do.
Representative Burkhardt, the Muslim.
Did the administration have you model at all the impact, potential impact on the pension system of their education reform proposal?
I think that's a good question for the treasurer's office.
Okay.
We are starting to follow those discussions, and independently, this fall, we started this assessment process where we're going to look at a number of things that could stress the system both positively and negatively. So for example, as Chris was talking about significant changes in workforce, we're going to model that with our actuaries about what that would look like. We're slated to complete that work in May, so it's not directly, we don't frankly have the details of the proposal that's out there right now. So we're approximating it, I think, with other general things that may change. Other things we're looking at are life expectancy, betterment and worsening of life expectancy, how would that affect your system?
Representative Maslin, do you still?
Yeah, thanks again. Confirming what we've been learning over time, and I appreciate that very much. Some of the things for the uninitiated on how pensions work seem to be counterintuitive in as much as I would think teachers work longer, it's better for everybody, you know, they're experienced, they're in the system. The school board doesn't hassle with, you know, turnover and stuff like that, but as you're pointing out, it increases the liability in the system because they earn more of the, I mean, the various charts that you pointed out that they earn more, they increase costs.
Yeah, and it really that's a great point, and there's a lot of nuance around it too.
That is certainly true.
So generally speaking, it is more expensive to provide a benefit to somebody who has worked for 30 years and then they retire and begin drawing a benefit than somebody who works for 10 years earlier in their career. They become terminated, vested, and then they collect later because of salary growth.
I would have thought that, sorry, yeah, that's true, but so what? But it's not so what? It's actually very significant.
It is significant, and the longer somebody works beyond the point at which they're assumed to retire can result in savings to the pension fund because there's fewer years you have to pay out a benefit.
Oh, okay.
So if somebody accelerates their retirement, you could have more years where you're paying out a benefit. So that could add costs.
Okay.
So there's a lot of nuance in there.
Thank you.
Representative Logan?
On that point, actually, a lot of the staff at the AOE used to be people who retired as teachers and then came to the state, became vested as state employees because they could continue work and get two pensions. Doesn't seem like that's happening anymore. I have a question, which was, it's actually not for us, it's for the treasurer's office, but if in your modeling, will you also be looking at the potential impacts of cessation of federal funds? I mean, it was such a big victory to get those positions funding their own retirement, but.
Yeah, so that would be sort of a different exercise because what we're trying to look at is the experience of, we're not looking at where the revenues come from, we're looking at the total amount needed. So that's the inquiry we're doing. I think there's that would be a bit of an easier exercise to model because we track every year how much we get from federal funds. So I think we could characterize, you know, the historical receipts from this area is X. And then I think it would be more legislative discussion to say if we did not have these funds coming from this source, where would we? And to your earlier point, it's 2013 is when that came.
Thank you. Yeah.
Chris, we already know that a lot of school districts are already having incentives for retirement to reduce their staffing.
Do we know
levels.
that?
We do.
Okay.
Yeah. From personal experience in my own school district, and then to try to reduce the number of positions. So the question is do we have that information at the JFO level to be able to calculate how many and what the impact is? Okay.
I think that's a great question to ask the Agency of Education when they're here on Tuesday to talk about, they're going to be talking about budget projections for the year. And that's, maybe we could let them know that we're going to have that question in advance. Is it a question for Chris?
That is a question about Charlie's question, and it is sort of related to the treasurer, but if their package, if the buyout includes a final year salary that is higher, does that affect the pension obligation?
Is there AFC?
Oftentimes, no. It kind of depends how it's structured, to be honest. But you know, if it's not compensation for actual cash, there are exclusions from the AFC. You know, we get data as reported, so in some ways it depends how it's reported, but we're cognizant of that, trying to account for it. Now we monitor as you know, starting at this time, we start monitoring what we're hearing for retirements, but you know, we won't have a picture of who's actually retiring in full in July. It's already obviously right in the middle of the summer is when we have our teacher retirements. You know, we don't have a cutoff well in advance. We really try and accommodate our membership to make a decision that's best for them. So we won't really know what our retirement numbers are until, let's say, into June. Start tracking it, kind of feel like you get a sense, but pretty sure for us to know that.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time, both of you, for being here. One other flag that is certainly not as significant a liability to staffing changes, but something that was just flagged for me yesterday, and we're going to get more testimony on in the future, is if there's a significant staff reduction, how does that impact unemployment insurance ratings, the unemployment insurance fund, less or so, but also just how does that impact the costs to districts and the state going forward? And so we'll learn more about that next week or the following week. Thank you. We're gonna take a break until 11:06.